Okay, before you begin listening, you may want to download the lesson outline PDF and open it up in your Adobe Reader program or print it out so that you can have it in front of you as you listen to this podcast. I would recommend that because we're going to be mentioning several sources for more information which you'll want to get a hold of, and you don't want to have to write those down during the lesson. So just get the PDF and you'll have all that information right there in front of you and not need to write it down. Last time we looked at some of the theories on the identity of the most excellent Theophilus to whom Luke's 2 books were written. And we also explored the probability that Luke composed his 2 books during the 2 years that Paul was in prison in Caesarea. We mentioned the earthquake in Laodicea also that occurred in AD 60, from which the Laodiceans were able to quickly recover using their own wealthy resources and without any help from Rome, which was an amazing thing to happen. Rome just about had to come to the aid of everybody when they had an earthquake, but the Laodiceans didn't need that. And that occurred in AD 60 when John had not yet written the book of Revelation, because he alludes to that idea that they were rich and needed nothing in his letter to the church at Laodicea in the book of Revelation. So that's helpful for us to know that, because evidently it must have occurred, that earthquake must have occurred shortly before the book was written, and so that helps date the book of Revelation right there. Tonight's lesson will be a little bit of a rewind, but it's important for us to insert this material here in regard to the dates of Matthew and Mark, since we're dealing with the dates of Luke and Acts at this point. It'll be helpful for us to nail all this down together, all 4 Gospels, and deal with them all at once here in this session, so that we'll not have to spend an awful lot of time with them later on down the road, especially the Gospel of John. We'll be dealing with it in the not-too-distant future. In our last session, I asked the question, is there any evidence in Paul's 6 earliest epistles, that's 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, and Romans, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Those letters were written somewhere between 50 and 58 AD, and those are his earliest epistles. Is there any evidence in those epistles that he had read any of the 4 Gospels? And I asked that question last time because I think that's going to be a key question for us to keep in mind as we try to nail down the dates of the Gospels. For instance, if Apostle Paul shows any familiarity with, or any allusions to, or even quotes of the 4 Gospels, then that'll really help us nail down when those 4 Gospels were written and help us assign dates to them. So we're going to look at some of that tonight. I think you're going to be very impressed with the amount of evidence we really have in regard to what Paul says about those early Gospels, especially Matthew. I did some study on that, and I'm going to present that to us tonight and help us think about the early date of Matthew and probably Mark as well. You know, there really are no long quotes from any of the 4 Gospels in Paul's epistles. However, there are some short phrases and several allusions and one big parallel section that appears to be pulled from some of the Gospels. And I want to spend some time on the parallels between Matthew 24 and Paul's 2 letters to the Thessalonians. Don Preston and Mike Sullivan and a lot of us preterist teachers have made a big deal about those parallels between Matthew 24 and the 2 Thessalonian epistles, and I think with good reason, because they really are very significant. I mean, there's just too many parallels and similar phrases and similar ideas to just dismiss as coincidence. When we have something as significant as these parallels, we really do need to take a serious look at them and use them to help us date both Paul's epistles and the Gospels that Paul is quoting here from. And these parallels between Matthew 24 and the Thessalonian epistles provide more than enough evidence, I believe, to show that the Gospel of Matthew was written before Paul wrote his 2 Thessalonian epistles in 51, 52, and maybe as late as 53 AD. And that means Matthew was written in the late 40s or very early 50s in order for Paul to be aware of them and so familiar with them that he could quote them and allude to them in a parallel fashion in his epistles. And so even though this evidence of parallels between Matthew 24 and the Thessalonian epistles is not the only evidence for the Gospels being written before he wrote his first epistles, it is compelling enough evidence, I think, to force the issue all by itself. We don't need an awful lot more, but there is more, and we'll look at some of that after we finish dealing with the parallels here in Matthew 24. One thing we need to establish right up front, though, in our study here of the dates for the 4 Gospels, is that we need to be aware of the fact that Matthew is probably the first Gospel to be produced. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of scholars who say that Mark was the first Gospel and that Matthew enhanced it. They don't want to give Matthew the credit for coming up with all that good stuff on his own. They have to have Mark write an abbreviated version and then Matthew expand on it, when in fact it's just the other way around. And we'll see that as we look through this evidence. But I believe the evidence shows that Matthew was written first, followed by Mark, and then Luke, and finally with John. We know this because Luke quotes and alludes to both Matthew and Mark, showing that Matthew and Mark were earlier, and Mark quotes from Matthew and not from Luke, showing that Matthew must have been written before Mark and that Luke was after Mark. Furthermore, John alludes to some of the unique material in Luke, implying that John was written after Luke, making it the last of the 4 Gospels. So that's the kind of evidence, I think, that will help us sequence these Gospels. And then now we can look and see when the first of those Gospels might have been written. Let's look at some of these connections. The first big one that I want to deal with is, of course, this connection between Matthew 24 and the Thessalonian epistles. And there's many parallels with Matthew 24 here in Paul's 2 epistles of 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. It may also have some parallels with Mark 13, although I haven't really studied those possibilities, and I'm not sure if Mike Sullivan or Don Preston or any of us other guys have looked at Mark 13 and perhaps Luke 21 as well. I don't think Luke 21 or Luke 17 has any parallels with the Thessalonian epistles, but I know Matthew 24 does, and possibly Mark as well. And if Mark does have some parallels with the Thessalonian correspondence, then that would help push the date of Mark back before 51 or 52 AD. And that would be good if we could nail that down. And perhaps some of you have done some study of that or know of some studies on the parallels between Mark and Mark 13 and Paul's 2 letters, and if so, send that to me by email, and I'd be very interested to have it. I haven't done that research myself yet, so it'd be good if somebody has done it to share it with me. It is utterly astounding to see how few futurist commentaries are willing to explore the significance of this amazing connection between Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. Of course, Don Preston and Mike Sullivan and others have done a really good job of documenting that linkage between those two books. And if you want to see their linkage, or their information is Don Preston's book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, pages 72 through 80. Now, you don't need to write this down. I've got this in the PDF, so you don't have to write it down and worry about not getting all of it on paper. Also, pages 72 through 80 in Don's book, and page 171, also he has an abbreviated form of that chart documenting the parallels. Also in Mike Sullivan's co-authored book, House Divided, pages 107 through 110, he has a chart of these parallels between Matthew 24 and Paul's letters. The similarities are so clear and strong that it cannot be ignored or explained away. It certainly allows for the possibility that Paul had access to a copy of Matthew's Gospel while he was writing his 2 epistles to the Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians, which also has a parallel to Matthew 24. Paul was obviously aware of everything Jesus had taught in the Olivet Discourse. The only question that I have is whether he had a photographic memory from the oral teaching of the other apostles that he had heard, or he had direct revelation from Christ on this subject that was radically parallel to what we read in Matthew 24. Or the third possibility is that he had access to a copy of Matthew's Gospel, because the numerous parallels between these 2 writings are just phenomenal. There's just too many of those parallels to explain away by mere coincidence. They're too clear, too direct, and too frequent to do that. So, and these 3 options that we gave, his photographic memory or direct revelation from Christ or access to the Gospel of Matthew, are not the only options, I don't think, but they're the most reasonable options, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. It could have been all of the above. Paul probably did have some parallel revelations about all this material, and he probably had heard the other apostles talking about it. But it certainly is interesting that the sequencing of his material in Thessalonian correspondence is the same sequence that we see in Matthew 24, and it's just numerous. I counted 15 parallels myself just in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, and that didn't have anything to do with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And so when we put all those parallels together, like Don Preston and Mike Sullivan have done, there's probably 25 different parallels between those 2 texts. So just way too many for us to discount and dismiss as just mere chance and coincidence. We've noted in the past that as soon as the Gentiles came into the church, and that was with Cornelius in AD 38, which was 8 years basically after Pentecost, the first Gentiles came in. The churches began to be established outside Palestine shortly thereafter in Antioch, AD 41. There was an immediate need then for written material to use in teaching these new Christians, especially the Gentiles. And so that need would have sparked the literary activities of the apostles to get busy and start producing written materials that they could send to those Gentile churches outside of Palestine. And Antioch, of course, is the primary church at that point that would have been needing that kind of teaching material. And we notice in the book of Acts, chapters 11 through 13, that they were really requesting a lot of help. They had Barnabas go up there, and they had Apostle Paul join them, and there was other teachers and prophets there helping Paul and Barnabas in their work of teaching those Gentiles in Antioch. And it would not be surprising to see that perhaps the apostles sent some writing material with Barnabas when they sent him up to Antioch to help teach the church. In view of the rumors of war that were generated by Caligula, Caesar Caligula, in AD 39 to 41, which is right after Cornelius, the first Gentile, became a Christian, and just before the church in Antioch was established, that's when Caligula issued his command to put a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. And that certainly put the Jewish people in a real big state of confusion and concern. And that's when the rumors of war circulated, because the Jews would certainly have revolted if Caligula had carried out that order to put a statue of himself in the temple. Fortunately, he died before that command could be carried out, but it certainly generated a lot of angst and zealot activity in Judea when they heard about that attempt to put a statue there. And so this is right about the time when the first Gentiles were coming into existence. And this whole incident with Caligula wanting to put a statue in the temple would have brought to the apostles' memory all those statements that Jesus had made about wars and rumors of wars. And of course that information is mentioned in Matthew 24, the Synoptic Apocalypse, the Olivet Discourse. And so the Olivet Discourse would have been extremely important for them to know about at that critical time when it looked like the abomination of desolation was about to be set up in the temple in 39 to 40 A.D. And the Jews were at the brink of open rebellion at that point. And certainly it's no coincidence that Matthew focuses some attention on the rumors of war at that point in his gospel, and says that these are only the beginning of birth pangs, that these are not the signs that the end has arrived, but were merely birth pangs and the beginning of the end, not the end itself. So this is what I need to make us aware of, is that when we look at the Olivet Discourse and these statements about rumors of wars and stuff like that, that's there for a reason, and it may help us date the gospel by seeing how those events were actually happening, perhaps at the time Matthew was writing, or shortly before he wrote, so that he's writing right after those events to help them understand that the end is not yet, that those were merely the birth pangs leading up to the end, and that there were further signs to look for. And one of those, of course, is the Great Tribulation, which he mentions in Matthew 24. So I think it makes a lot of sense for us to see the book of Matthew, or Gospel of Matthew, written right about the time Caligula tried to put up his statue in the temple, which produced wars and rumors of wars among the Jews. Certainly the apostles would have been orally teaching the church about this situation and helping them understand what was happening and reassuring them that this was not yet the end. The question is when that oral teaching about the Olivet Discourse would have been committed to writing. Certainly that scare with Caligula would have created a lot of concern and confusion, which the apostles would have needed to deal with quickly and thoroughly. And it seems likely that Matthew, who had been a tax collector and who therefore obviously had scribal capabilities, would have been urged to write down all of Jesus' teaching for the church, to clear the confusion and quiet their concerns, because you can bet they were very concerned about that attempt by Caligula to put that statue there. It means that they were going to go into war against Rome, and they would probably lose their lives and their houses and everything. And so they needed to get out of there before that revolt took place. And that's why I think the Gospel of Matthew was written about that point, because it's helping them settle down and realize that this is not yet the end, that there's more things that have to happen first. And that's exactly the approach we see in the two letters of Paul to the Thessalonians. Notice they were suffering tribulation. And in fact, some of their members of the church there had been killed in that persecution, evidently, according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. And the implication is in chapter 4 also of 1 Thessalonians that some of them had already died in that persecution and that they were grieving over the loss of those members in the persecution. And Paul gives them that information about the rapture there to help them understand that they were going to be reunited with their departed loved ones at the parousia, and that they didn't have to fear a loss of contact with them or to fear their dead loved ones missing out on the benefits at the parousia, that they would all enjoy and receive those benefits together at the same time when the dead were raised and the living saints were changed and caught up together with them and reunited with them in the presence of Christ. So all of this is going on here, and I think this will help us understand how the book of Matthew, or Gospel of Matthew, fits into this whole sequencing and time structure that we're looking at here in the book of Acts. It was written, Paul's letters of Thessalonians were written to help the Thessalonians see that the end had not yet arrived. And I think that's exactly how Matthew 24 is used as well. And I think that's why Paul quotes from and alludes to Matthew 24 so much, is because that material in Matthew 24 suited his purpose very well in regard to the Thessalonians. They needed to be settled down because they were thinking that this persecution they were under in 50 AD or 51 AD was a signal that the end of the age had arrived. And Paul says, no, not so fast. It's not yet here. There's some other things that still have to happen yet. And that's where he quotes from Matthew 24 and alludes to those parallel texts there to help quiet down the concerns of the Thessalonians. And that seems to be the same way that Matthew uses that material in Matthew chapter 24. So it was a perfect way for Paul to make use of it. There's still some big events yet to happen before the end arrived. And it seems to me that Paul is drawing his information about this from Matthew's Gospel. Paul wrote his first letter to the Thessalonians while he was at Corinth on his second missionary journey, somewhere around 51, maybe 52 A.D. He wrote his second letter about a year or so, or less than a year maybe after that. And evidently his first letter had caused a little bit of confusion, and he had to clear that up in a second letter. And especially the idea that the man of lawlessness was about to arrive, and the gathering together, the rapture, was about to occur. And so he has to help them understand that that cannot occur yet until some other things finish happening. But Paul's use of all this material means that Matthew must have been written at least a year or so before Paul left on his second journey. There would have had to have been time to make copies of it and get it into circulation so that Paul could take it with him on his second journey. And so he must have seen a copy of it in Jerusalem when he went there for the Jerusalem Council in 49 A.D., and then had a copy of it made for himself to carry with him on his way back to Antioch, from which he launched his second missionary journey. And we know he had some writings with him on that second missionary journey, one of them of which we're very familiar with, and that's that decree document from the Jerusalem Council. He took that with him on his second trip to give to all the churches scattered out through Turkey and Greece, to help them understand that the Judaizers were not correct. And so if he had that document with him, why not some other ones? It'd make perfect sense to believe that he took with him, as he tells us later, he had with him on his missionary journeys, books and parchments, which were scrolls and codexes. So he may have had some with him on his second missionary journey besides that decretal document. And so this would allow for Matthew to have been written in 49, maybe very early 50, just before Paul left on his second missionary journey, and took a copy of it with him. And that's probably a part of the books and parchments that he carried with him everywhere he went. The church in Antioch most likely then got a copy of it whenever he took it back with him from the council in Jerusalem in 49 A.D. The church in Antioch probably would have made their own copy if it had not already been copied for them by the Jerusalem church. And then Paul would have taken a copy with him as well on his journey. This very effectively, I believe, fixes the date of Matthew somewhere between the Caligula crisis in AD 39 and the Jerusalem Council in AD 49. So somewhere in that 10 years between Caligula and the Jerusalem Council, we can place the Gospel of Matthew, I think, as being written somewhere in there. I would tend to put it a little earlier, in the early 40s, because the confusion that was generated by Caligula must have needed some quick instruction by the apostles, and I think that Matthew's Gospel supplies that kind of instruction to help them get through that crisis. So it would seem fair to assert that Matthew's written in the early 40s, but it could have been written as late as 49 A.D., and so I'm going to leave that range of dates open for us, because anywhere in there seems a likely date for the Gospel of Matthew, and probably Mark as well. Not long after Matthew was written, Mark would have been written. And that's where it becomes interesting for us to do some studies of Mark 13 and compare that with the information in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, because if indeed we can find some parallels between Mark 13 and Paul's letters to Thessalonians, then that means that Mark 13, or Mark, the Gospel of Mark, was written also before Paul's second missionary journey, when he wrote his two epistles to the Thessalonians. So somewhere in that span of 10 years, the Gospel of Matthew was probably produced, AD 39 to AD 49. This allows an earlier date for the Gospels of Mark and Luke, and maybe even for the Gospel of John as well. Now, I think that's probably a very good indicator of the early date for Matthew. I don't know how anybody could really brush that aside and say that those parallels between Matthew 24 and Paul's epistles are just coincidental and by chance, and that they're really not significant. I think they're highly significant. And I think Don Preston and Mike Sullivan and others who have made a lot of those connections are right on the track. I think that's exactly the case. These really do point to a early date for the Matthew before Paul's first two epistles, or two of his first three epistles. If we put Galatians ahead of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and that's quite possible. But still, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were written in the very, very early 50s, 51, 52, or 53 at the most. And that means that the Matthew Gospel must have been available to him and therefore written before he wrote the Thessalonians. Another significant connection with Matthew is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, chapter 3, verse 3, and chapter 5, verse 9, where it talks about the saints being destined for tribulation, but not destined for wrath, and destined for obtaining salvation. Those three key phrases are parallel to some material in Matthew chapter 24, verse 9, verses 21 through 22, and Matthew 24, verse 29, where it talks about they will deliver you up to tribulation, and those days of tribulation will be cut short so that the elect will be saved from the wrath to come. So those key words there, tribulation, saved, and wrath, are found in the same context in both Matthew and in 1 Thessalonians. And so we see several more parallels there that really point unmistakably back to Matthew as being available to Paul as he was writing those two letters. If he didn't have the Gospel of Matthew with him, he certainly had a photographic memory, or else God had revealed it to him directly. And he certainly claims that he had direct revelation. We don't know whether he had revelation on this particular subject or not, but he did have direct revelation on other occasions. But these similarities are just too close to be coincidence or to be by chance. In Acts chapter 14, verse 22, Paul is preaching to the saints there in Turkey, I think Pisidian Antioch, or Iconium, or Lystra, or Derbe, one of those three places, on his second missionary journey. And he's talking about the persecution that they were undergoing, and he says, through much tribulation we must enter the kingdom. And that's another parallel to Matthew 24. And Matthew chapter 13, verse 21, also has a mention of that tribulation that would arise when the Son of Man is about to come. Okay, so those are, I think, the most significant parallels that we see between Paul's earliest writings and the Gospel of Matthew. And they're very convincing to me. I think I would pretty much accept that as strong evidence for the early date of Matthew before 50 A.D., probably before 49 A.D. I want to look at some other allusions in some of his earlier epistles to material that's found in the three synoptic Gospels especially, and in the book of Acts as well. Notice in Acts 13:51 it says that they shook off the dust of their feet in protest against those cities that were persecuting them and not listening to the gospel. And it's interesting that Luke uses that phrase because that's not exactly the way he says it in his gospel, but it is the way that both Matthew and Mark say it in their gospels, implying that Luke had perhaps seen Matthew and Mark before he wrote and was using or borrowing some of their phraseology in the book of Acts. We'll see that in Matthew 10, verse 14, of course, and Mark 6:11. And then similar, but not as much the same, in Luke's account of Luke 9, verse 5, and Luke 10, verse 11. And of course, this was on the first missionary journey that Luke wrote, is writing about. These are events that occurred on the first missionary journey. Luke wasn't with them at that point, but he's talking about it, and Paul evidently was narrating that story for him, and Paul told him what he said on that occasion, and Luke wrote it down. And so that shows that Paul was using the phraseology that we find in the mouth of Jesus, as recorded in Matthew and Mark. He's not using the phraseology that Luke did in his account. That's interesting. I think that's very significant. I think that'll help us understand that Paul must have had Matthew and probably Mark available to him before he went on his second missionary journey for sure. Barnabas had probably heard this very teaching about shaking off the dust of their feet from the apostles in Jerusalem and might have shared it with Paul. So that may be the way Paul learned of that language and that phraseology about shaking the dust off the feet. He may have heard it from Barnabas, who had heard it from the apostles in Jerusalem. So it doesn't demand that Paul had seen the gospel statements about it, but it certainly would allow for that possibility, since it's the very same phraseology that we find in Matthew and Mark. This brings up the further question about what else Paul might have learned from the apostles in Jerusalem through Barnabas and Silas without having read the gospel accounts and learned it there. And of course, that would require a mammoth amount of study, I'm sure, to try to pull out that information from Paul's epistles. Fortunately, some scholars have done a lot of that study for us, and we can benefit from their efforts. But we also need to remember that Paul claimed that he had direct revelation from Christ on a number of these issues, and so it's certainly possible that he could have gotten some of this material from direct revelation. At least these little minor coincidences that we're looking at now, not the major linkage that we looked at in Matthew 24. I think there's just too many parallels there for us to chalk up to direct revelation or to listening to the apostles teaching verbally. I believe those indicate an actual awareness of and possession of the Gospel of Matthew in order to explain those numerous parallels. But these little minor ones, I think we can maybe chalk up to some other cause. We don't have to say that he drew them straight out of Matthew's Gospel. For instance, in Romans chapter 3, verse 31, There's a statement there, do we then nullify the law through faith? And of course that kind of points us back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, where Jesus said, do not think that I came to abolish the law. Now the word abolish and nullify are two different words in the Greek. And so there's not a verbal parallel there completely. But the phrases that are used are very similar and somewhat parallel. Do we then nullify the law through faith? And I did not come to abolish the law. And so there's a similarity there which has led some scholars to think that perhaps Paul was familiar with Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, when he was going after the Judaizers in the book of Romans. The Judaizers probably accused Paul of abolishing the law, which they did, which they knew Jesus had told them not to do. So the Judaizers had either heard Christ say those things or else had heard the apostles teaching it. There's no demand here that Paul was referencing the written statements of Matthew chapter 5. He could have simply been reacting to the accusations of the Judaizers. However, when we remember that Paul is writing to the Roman Christians who had not been taught by Jesus or the apostles originally, they were certainly not a part of Jesus' original band of apostles, then the possibility surfaces that they may have been troubled by Judaizers there in Rome, who were then making reference to the written words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, of which the Roman Church by this time in 58 A.D. could easily have had a copy. And so there's a lot of ways to explain that, but it certainly does not mitigate against the theory that they had a copy of Matthew at that time in 58. And that would be before Paul was arrested and put in prison in Caesarea in 58 A.D. There's another allusion here to some of the contents in the Gospel of Matthew found in Romans chapter 2, verse 27, when it talks about the uncircumcised. And this is directed at the Judaizers, and he's telling the Judaizers, the uncircumcised Gentile, will he not judge you, who, though you have circumcision and you're keepers of the law, are a transgressor of the law? And this idea of Gentiles judging the Jewish believers is a phenomenal parallel with Matthew chapter 12, verse 41, where it talks about the men of Nineveh, who were Gentiles, standing up with this generation of Jews at the judgment and condemning the Jews because they had not repented at the preaching of Jesus. There's a direct parallel there, and it's just so close that it would be hard to believe Paul was not familiar with the statements of Jesus, whether it was in the written gospel or whether he had just heard the other apostles talking about it. One way or the other, he is very familiar with the words of Jesus about Gentiles judging the Jews at the parousia. Another interesting parallel is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 27, where it makes the statement there, eat anything that is set before you. And that's almost exactly the same phrase and verb or words that are used in Luke chapter 10, verses 7 and 8, where he says, eating and drinking what they give you, eat what is set before you. Same phrase that we find in 1 Corinthians 10:27. Now that may have been a stock phrase that all the rabbis and Jewish people of the first century were familiar with and used. It may have been a cliche that Jewish people used when they were out in the Gentile world. They would eat and drink whatever they give you and eat what is set before you without asking any questions for conscience sake. You don't, if they set pork in front of you, don't ask them if it's pork, because if they say yeah, then you can't eat it. But as long as you don't ask and they don't tell, you can eat it. And it's interesting that they did that. Even in the Talmudic writings today, they advise that practice. And so my guess is that was a stock rabbinical phrase that they used in the first century. And it was not just something that Jesus invented, but was something that he was drawing from the culture around him. It was a familiar cliche that they all used in their conversation, especially when they were out in the Gentile world. And of course, this doesn't demand that Paul had read Luke's gospel, but it does suggest that Paul was aware of what Jesus had taught on this, either through Barnabas, Silas, or the teaching of the apostles that he had heard while he was in Jerusalem on one of his missionary trips or whatever, or even by direct revelation, or just simply parroting a stock phrase in their culture. A lot of ways to explain that parallel in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 27. And there's a lot more here. I don't know how much more time we've got, but I'll look at a few more of these allusions and similarities and parallels that we find in Paul's writings versus the Gospels. Another one can be found here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 and 14, as well as in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18, both in his earlier and in his later epistles. He uses this idea about you shall not muzzle the ox, and the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. And this third statement, the laborer is worthy of his wages. Those three statements found in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy are paralleled in two of the Gospels. In Luke chapter 10, verse 7, it says the laborer is worthy of his wages. Same phrase that we found in 1 Timothy 5, verse 18. And also Matthew 10, verse 10, it uses a similar phrase, for the worker is worthy of his support, and that's what we found in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 9 and 14. And some more similar ideas in Luke 9, verses 1 through 5, and Luke 10, 1 through 12. Ideas about how they were to support those missionaries when they were out working and presenting the gospel and sharing the gospel. Okay, another parallel or similar phrase that's in Paul's writings to what we find in the Gospels is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 26, where Paul is talking about the institution of the Lord's Supper and how those early Christians observed that Lord's Supper every first day of the week when they gathered together to break bread. They observed the Lord's Supper together, and they were doing it in a dishonorable way that was dishonoring the poor among them. And Paul is trying to correct that abuse of the Lord's Supper that they were engaging in. And he says here in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 24 to 26, he says, to do this in remembrance of me, and that you are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. Now, as you know, this is a verse that our critics use against us to say, well, why do you still observe the Lord's Supper if the Lord has already come? Well, because when you understand what he meant by that, you'll see why it's still appropriate for us to observe it. Notice in Luke 22, verses 16 through 19, there's two phrases which help us understand what Paul means. in regard to proclaiming the Lord's death until He comes and proclaims the significance of it and restores His eating together with us, so that we'll no longer do it in memory of Him, but do it in His presence at His table in His kingdom that He will bring with Him when He comes. And He'll resume eating it with us at His table in His kingdom. Notice in Luke 22, verses 16 through 19, He says, quoting Jesus, says, "I shall never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And therefore," He says, "do it in remembrance of me, do it in my memory, until I return to resume eating it with you at my table in my kingdom." So, fascinating. Luke just really gives us a great commentary on what Paul is meaning when he quotes some of that language in his epistle to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Notice also Matthew 26, verse 29 has some parallel information about this that helps us understand what Paul is saying. Jesus in Matthew 26:29 says, "I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So what's going to happen at the parousia? Are they going to cease eating it and drinking it with Him? No. They're going to resume eating it and drinking it with Him in His kingdom. No longer eating it in His memory, proclaiming His death, but instead eating and drinking with Him at His table in His kingdom after the kingdom has arrived. And no longer looking forward to its arrival, but now celebrating its arrival. Mark 14, verse 25 has the same kind of language there. It says, "I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And so it's very clear, I think, to me, that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which would be in 57 AD, that he had in front of him some of the gospel accounts. He probably didn't have Luke's gospel yet, although that's debatable, because it does seem that he's drawing from Luke's account a little bit. Some of the phraseology there is very, very similar. So Luke's gospel could have been written on that third missionary trip just before Paul wrote his letter to the 1 Corinthians. So it's easily possible. But one thing's for sure, he had access to Matthew and Mark, if not Luke, before he wrote 1 Corinthians, because the phraseology and the thought and the idea behind his words in 1 Corinthians 11 are just absolutely based on what Jesus had said at the Last Supper. And it's just too close, too similar for us to explain away as just something he had heard from the apostles. 1 Corinthians 15 also has some things in it which I believe point back to an awareness of the Gospels, at least Matthew, and probably Mark as well. Notice in 1 Corinthians 15 he alludes to the witnesses of the risen Christ. And what he says there about those number of witnesses who saw Christ after he had been raised from the dead implies that he has seen the accounts of the resurrection that are recorded for us in Matthew and Mark, and maybe even the Luke as well. However, it does not show any familiarity with John's gospel account. So that tells us that perhaps John's gospel had not been written at the time Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and that, of course, is the way I take it. I understand that to be the real truth of the matter, is that John's Gospel was not written until after Paul was on his way to Rome to stand before Nero in trial. So Matthew, Mark, and possibly Luke were in Apostle Paul's hands at the time he wrote 1 Corinthians 15, where he mentions those witnesses of the risen Christ and enumerates them and lists them out for us. Also in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 15, where Paul gives instructions to the married and to the divorced and to the single saints about remaining in whatever condition they're in and not changing it, because it would only bring hardship to them to change their marital condition at this point in the present distress. And so in that instructions that he gives to married and unmarried folks in 1 Corinthians 7, notice he says, "To the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife." And notice he says, I'm not giving these instructions, but it's the Lord. He says, I'm drawing this from the Lord. This is not just my advice. This is coming straight from the Lord himself. Gave this instruction. Well, where did the Lord give this instruction? Was it given to him directly by direct revelation, or is he drawing it from the Gospel of Matthew? And that seems to be the source, because when we compare what he says here to the married folk in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 through 15, it's very similar to what we find in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, Matthew 19, verses 6 through 9, as well as Mark chapter 10 and Luke chapter 16. So there's some definite reasons there to look closely at the Gospels as the source for his teaching, and suggesting that those three Gospels perhaps, and not just two or one, but all three of the synoptic Gospels may have been written before Paul wrote his first epistle to the Corinthians in 57 A.D. Another parallel I think that's interesting to look at, although it's not as significant and not as profound, I think, as the other ones that we've looked at so far, is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, where Paul says, I urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. And that's a similar thought, not a similar phrase, but a similar thought behind it, to what we see in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, where Jesus is talking and he says, I am gentle and humble of heart, and will give you rest. Come unto me, all you who are heavy laden, burdened, and I am gentle and humble of heart, and I will give you rest, is the idea. And so it seems like Paul may be alluding to that statement, but he could have known about that just by the oral teaching of the apostles. It doesn't demand that he had Matthew's gospel in front of him to draw that from. It's certainly possible, and we cannot leave that out as a possibility, but it doesn't demand that he had Matthew's gospel in front of him to understand that. Okay, well, I think that's about where we're going to stop here. Next time we'll probably pick up a little bit more with the events in 60 A.D. So that what we've looked at tonight shows that the Gospels of Matthew and Mark were probably written somewhere between AD 39 and AD 49. And the Gospel of Luke then could be pushed back a little earlier than what we had suggested in previous broadcast, to a range between 54 and 58 AD. And then the book of Acts, of course, written in 58 to 60 while Paul was in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, awaiting his voyage to Rome and the trial before Nero. And then right after Paul left to head toward Rome, and Luke was with him, and that's why Luke doesn't record it. John wrote his gospel, I believe, in 60 AD or maybe 61, while Paul was en route to Rome, and maybe as late as the first year Paul was in prison at Rome. So that gives us a date for all 4 of the Gospels and the book of Acts, somewhere in that range. And this will be in the written outline, so you don't need to write this down. Be sure and download that before you listen to the broadcast. Thank you very much.